So far, in this series, I have argued for substance dualism in a number of ways. I have argued that the self both exists and must be simple. I have argued that various mental phenomenon can be seen to be immaterial upon introspection. And I have argued that the self possesses certain modal properties which material objects cannot possess. Now I want to argue that knowledge itself, at least of certain kinds, must also be immaterial. This is based upon the observation that knowledge of all physical facts does not suffice for having all propositional knowledge, and this, in turn, requires that there are some immaterial facts. This video will present and defend the knowledge argument for dualism. The knowledge argument goes back most famously to Frank Jackson, who made it popular by giving the following thought experiment. Mary is a brilliant scientist who is, for whatever reason, forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires, let us suppose, all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, and use terms like red, blue, and so on. What will happen when Mary is released from her black and white room or is given a color television monitor? Will she learn anything or not? It seems just obvious that she will learn something about the world and our visual experience of it. But then it is inescapable that her previous knowledge was incomplete, but she had all the physical information. Ergo, there is more to have than that, and physicalism is false. Independently of Jackson, and in the same year, Howard Robinson developed a nearly identical thought experiment arguing in favor of dualism. Except for where Jackson had used color vision as an example, Robinson used sound. As he explains, imagine that a deaf scientist should become the world's leading expert on the neurology of hearing. Thus, if we suppose neurology more advanced than the present, we can imagine that he knows everything that there is to know about the physical processes involved in hearing from the eardrum in. It remains intuitively obvious that there is something which this scientist will not know, namely what it is like to hear. While Robinson's argument is as interesting as Jackson's is by far the more widely discussed. Consequently, we will use the Mary thought experiment for the remainder of this video. Both of these thought experiments highlight that something appears to be missing in a purely physicalist picture of the world, namely the phenomenal character of certain sensory experiences. As John DePoe explains, no matter how much physical information Mary possesses, she is never going to be in a position to figure out what it's like to be appeared to readily. In other words, physical information alone is not sufficiently robust to deduce the truths that characterize conscious experience. And Daniel Stoljar and Yujin Nagasawa go on to suggest that the knowledge intuition presents us with a prima facie modal truth, a truth about what is possible. What it says is that it is possible for someone to know all the physical truths about, say, smelling a rose without knowing what it is like to smell a rose. The issue is not about what, in fact, anybody does know. Perhaps nobody knows all the physical truths about smelling roses. And the issue is not whether it is psychologically possible to know all the physical truths of this sort without knowing the phenomenal truths. Perhaps this is not psychologically possible. The issue is, rather, logical. Knowledge of the physical sort does not suffice logically for knowledge of the phenomenal sort. Having explained the basic motivation behind the knowledge argument, we are now in a position to erect it formally. Following John DePoe, we may express the argument through the following syllogism. 1. If complete possession of all knowledge of physical truths isn't sufficient to provide all propositional knowledge of the actual world, then physicalism is false. 2. Complete possession of all knowledge of physical truths isn't sufficient to provide all propositional knowledge of the actual world. 3. Therefore, physicalism is false. This argument is logically valid, so the only way for the physicalist to reject the conclusion is to reject one of the premises. Physicalists have, of course, developed numerous creative objections to each premise. But before we get to those, let's consider a little more carefully the reasons in favor of each of the premises. The first premise is probably the less controversial of the two. After all, if we define physicalism as the thesis that all facts are physical facts, then it's not immediately obvious why knowledge of all physical facts would not suffice for all propositional knowledge. Propositional knowledge is just the sort of knowledge which can be expressed as a declarative sentence. It's the sort of knowledge which can be true or false, as opposed to knowledge of persons or knowledge of how to perform certain tasks. So if all truths are about physical facts, then knowledge of all physical facts should suffice for knowledge of all truths. This is especially so if we adopt one of the most popular definitions among physicalists for what it means to say that something is physical. Viewers will recall that in the first video in this series, I noted that it's not actually all that easy to define what exactly the word physical is supposed to mean. This is due, in part, to a philosophical puzzle known as Hempel's dilemma, according to which the language of physics, as used to describe reality, is either empty or false. The dilemma argues that physicalism is problematic because it relies on a notion of the physical that is defined by current physics, which is always subject to revision and is incomplete. The intricacies of that puzzle need not concern us in this video, but suffice it to say that the most popular response to this dilemma among physicalists has been to say that the physical just refers to those things that would be directly described by an idealized, completed physics, whatever they may be. The relevance of this to the first premise of the knowledge argument is that if physical facts are just being defined as those facts which could be described by an idealized incompleted physics, then physical facts can, by definition, be described in propositional form. This means that if all facts were physical, and one were to know all physical facts, then they could, by definition, describe them, which would straightforwardly entail that they had all propositional knowledge. This, of course, entails that the first premise of the argument is true. As DePoe concludes, "As I have characterized it, if physicalism is true, then everything that exists is either a fundamental constituent of physics or reducible to fundamental constituents of physics by being causally realized by them. The upshot of this analysis is that there is nothing over and above the fundamental constituents of physics. So, being a rock is nothing over and above the functional state that causally realizes being a rock. Likewise, physicalism implies that being in pain is nothing over and above the functional state that causally realizes being in pain. All of this lends credence to the notion that if physicalism is true, then knowing all the fundamental physical truths about the world is sufficient for knowing all the truths about the world. More could be said in defense of the first premise, and I will say more in defense of it when we consider objections to this premise. But for now, I think that the basic plausibility of the first premise has been established. It would appear to be almost definitionally true. The second premise is where the merry thought experiment becomes important, for it is cases like these that appear to support the truth of this premise. If it is possible for one to know every physical fact about a phenomenal experience without, thereby, possessing all propositional knowledge, then there must be some fact or facts about phenomenal experience that are not physical. And it appears all too obvious that a colorblind neuroscientist in possession of all the physical facts pertaining to color vision would still come to know a new fact if their color vision were restored to them. As Richard Fumerton puts it, there is a world of difference between thinking of an experience and actually being directly aware of the qualities of that experience. If that weren't true, we could save a great deal of money on our wine bill. We could get the wonderful flavors and aromas of the expensive Cabernet just by concentrating our imagination on the relevant experience. But is this really propositional knowledge that Mary comes to possess, as opposed to, say, experiential knowledge? Propositional knowledge is the sort of knowledge that can be expressed as a declarative sentence and can bear the value of truth. And there are good reasons to believe that Mary would indeed acquire propositional knowledge as a result of acquiring color vision. To see why, consider an example from John DePoe regarding Mariana. He says, Mariana is a woman who has never experienced color for whatever reasons, although her vision is normal and she believes so justifiably. Mariana agrees to participate in a psychological experiment where she is placed in a house where everything is colorfully and arbitrarily decorated, which is where she experiences color for the first time. Mariana, however, is not taught the names of these colors, nor is she allowed to see objects that she knows to be a certain color from testimony alone, such as that the sky is blue, ripe tomatoes are red, bananas are yellow, grass is green, etc. At the end of the experiment, she is presented with 4 slides of clear examples of red, yellow, blue, and green, and she is asked which color sample she thinks corresponds with the color normal-sighted people see when they look at the sky under ordinary daytime conditions. We can imagine that after deliberating about the description she has heard of the beauty of the clear blue sky, Mariana points to the red slide and proudly says, I believe it is this one. Of course, she is wrong. It is not until Mariana leaves the psychological experiment that she finally comes to know the truth that the sky appears to be blue in the phenomenal sense. From this insight, we can conclude that both Mary and Mariana don't merely come to know this is what it's like to experience redness for the first time. What is more important is that both Mary and Mariana come to know new propositional truths about phenomenal properties. Minimally, they come to know the truth that phenomenal redness is exemplified. When Mariana believes that the red slide corresponds to the color of the sky, it shows that even though she has the concept of phenomenal blueness, she lacks knowledge as to which phenomenal concept corresponds to the way the sky appears. And it can be shown that Mary's knowledge would be propositional in other ways as well. Again, DePoe explains, Mary also comes to know some new truths about her sensations. For instance, Mary comes to know that sensations of red are more like sensations of green than they are like sensations of sourness. Intuitively, Mary has no grasp of these truths until she has the relevant experiences. Hence, we have excellent grounds for concluding not just that Mary comes to know something new, but that this would be a type of propositional knowledge. This gives us all the reason we need to affirm the second premise of the argument. Now, cases like Mary and Mariana are, by far, the most popular way of defending the second premise of the knowledge argument. There is, however, another lesser-known way to support this premise, namely by defending a particular account of empirical knowledge based upon the theory of direct acquaintance. Because this theory of empirical knowledge is controversial, this method of justifying the second premise is seldom employed. But I have the luxury of having already defended this theory of knowledge in prior videos. See my series on epistemology and my video on the modal argument for dualism for details. Hence, I can simply lay out how this line of reasoning supports the second premise without having to defend the details. Skeptics of acquaintance theory are referred to the aforementioned videos for a more substantial defense of the overall theory. As a brief reminder, Acquaintance is a direct relation of awareness which obtains between a mind and a thought, fact, property, or sense datum. A good example here might be the sort of relation one stands in to their pain when they have, say, a headache. There aren't any inferential steps one needs to undertake to determine that they are in pain. They are simply directly confronted with this fact. That's the sort of relation I'm talking about by the term acquaintance. My theory of epistemic justification follows Richard Fumerton in claiming that non-inferential justification consists in three distinct acquaintance relations obtaining. These are 1. Acquaintance with a thought, 2. Acquaintance with the fact which makes the thought true, and 3. Acquaintance with the correspondence relation which obtains between the thought and the fact. When all three relations obtain, then one is in possession of everything which makes his belief true and needs nothing more than that by way of justification, for the truth of the belief is guaranteed. It is epistemically certain. Okay, so that is as brief an explanation of acquaintance theory as I can give. But how exactly does this theory, if true, support the second premise of the knowledge argument? Well, the reason is that direct acquaintance yields an indirect realist theory of our relationship to physical objects. Again, indirect realism was defended in detail in my video on the modal argument for dualism, but in the present context, it is of interest to us because it suggests that our knowledge of physical objects is indirect and based upon sense data, which is independent of the existence of physical objects, as John DePoe explains. Direct acquaintance epistemically privileges the phenomenal character of consciousness over knowledge of physical information. Recall that my position is a foundationalist one, where the basic beliefs cannot be arbitrarily selected, otherwise the epistemic regress could not be stopped. The non-arbitrary stopping point for this regress is with a belief where one is directly aware that it is a truth. In turn, this motivates how the triad of acquaintances can non-arbitrarily provide non-inferential knowledge. The upshot is that our knowledge of qualia does not, and given this way of acquiring knowledge, cannot be deduced from our knowledge of physical truths alone. One cannot be directly acquainted with physical objects because, recall that justification by acquaintance guarantees the truth of the beliefs which are justified in this way. But beliefs about physical objects are never guaranteed to be true because of the possibilities of distortions, illusions, dreams, hallucinations, and even more extravagantly, the possibility of Descartes' all-powerful, all-deceiving demon, or even the Matrix. Given that we can never rule these possibilities out with certainty, we can never be certain of the existence of any physical objects. So what we know non-inferentially by direct acquaintance cannot be known with certainty. Hence, knowledge of the mental has a sort of privilege over knowledge of the physical world. Again, DePoe explains, since I have committed myself to epistemological indirect realism, it follows from my position that one cannot non-inferentially know that physical objects exist. One's knowledge of the physical world is mediated by those mental states whose phenomenal content appears to be the same in both veridical and non-veridical experiences. Consequently, our knowledge of the physical world comes primarily from our knowledge of the phenomenal qualities that the physical world causes us to experience. When we think about physical objects, on my account, we always do so in terms of the causal effects they produce in us. Thus, my understanding of strawberry as a physical object is something like the cause, whatever it is, that produces the phenomenal experiences of redness, sweetness, firmness, etc. What we come to know about physical objects, then, is only what we can legitimately infer from the phenomena they cause us to have. With regard to the knowledge intuition, The upshot for this view of physical objects is that we would not expect to be able to infer any new knowledge about the phenomenal character of consciousness from physical information alone. In fact, it is the exact opposite. What we know about the physical is epistemically dependent on our knowledge of the phenomenal. Now again, I realize that all of this is incredibly controversial, but I also think that each of these points is defensible, and I have defended them in considerable detail elsewhere. What's more, these points further support the truth of the second premise. But if both the first and the second premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true, and so physicalism must be false. Of course, philosophical controversies are never settled quite that easily. Physicalist philosophers have proposed numerous objections to each premise of this argument, and it is to answering those objections that we now turn. We will begin by considering objections to premise 1. Objections to this premise cluster around the idea that the same facts can be described in two different ways, and as a result of this truth, one might know the same fact in two different ways. Hence, the Mary thought experiment establishes only an epistemic gap, but not an ontological gap. There is indeed an epistemic gap between knowledge gained from our sensory impressions and knowledge gained through other means, but that does not imply an ontological gap between the mental and the physical. As Tim Crane explains, given that there can be genuinely different facts in the object of knowledge sense, without this difference corresponding to any ontological difference, it follows that physicalism, as an ontological thesis, is not a thesis about facts in the object of knowledge sense. Physicalism can be true, and yet Mary in the room can be ignorant of certain facts. The knowledge argument does not refute physicalism. Now, the most popular way of cashing out this line of defense is known as the phenomenal concept strategy. The basic idea is that some concepts require experience in order to be possessed by someone. These are so-called phenomenal concepts, and as this applies to the Mary thought experiment, the idea is that once her color vision is restored, Mary gains these phenomenal concepts. These new concepts enable her to form new thoughts, which account for her new propositional knowledge. Since two conceptually independent descriptions can pick out the same property, the defender of physicalism might claim that it is possible for Mary's experience of color to provide the opportunity for her to acquire different propositional knowledge than she knew while she was colorblind. Nonetheless, both propositions will pick out the same property or fact that she knew about when she could only see black and white. This is thought to say physicalism because, supposedly, the existence of phenomenal concepts does not imply that there are any non-physical things. There are just different ways of thinking about physical things, and this would falsify the first premise of the knowledge argument. Now, one popular criticism of the phenomenal concept strategy among physicalists is to deny that phenomenal concepts exist at all. For example, Alex Grzankowski and Michael Tai say, because concepts are easy to possess and very shareable, there don't seem to be any concepts in principle off limits to Mary in her room. Mary spends time out in the world discussing at length color and color vision. Mary is able to discuss colors in detail and engage in disagreement over them. She gains concepts in the usual way by interacting with others and reading books, and she thinks thoughts about experiences, colors, and brains. Looking for thoughts Mary cannot have starts looking like a dead end. As a substance dualist, of course, I do not agree with Grzankowski and Tai that phenomenal concepts do not exist. But I think that they make an important point, namely that if one is a physicalist, then there doesn't appear to be any reason why phenomenal concepts should exist. It's not clear why it is that one should have to undergo any particular type of phenomenal experience to acquire the relevant concepts to think the relevant thoughts. Indeed, the whole point of the knowledge argument is to highlight the fact that certain properties about experience require a special way of being known precisely because they are not physical. So one might think that the phenomenal concept strategy doesn't save physicalism, it merely draws our attention back to the difficulty which generated the argument in the first place. As Thomas Raleigh observes, of course, for this appeal to phenomenal concepts to count as a physicalist strategy, one must be able to give a purely physical account of what it is to acquire and deploy a phenomenal concept. That is, one must be able to give an account of what it is to think of a putatively neural property in a special, distinctively sensory way that does not just take for granted the existence of a special phenomenal aspect to the property. Giving such an account is by no means easy to do, for the very idea that there are concepts which one would need to undergo a specific type of experience to acquire seems antithetical to physicalism. As Howard Robinson observes, it used to be the case that dualists were the only people who believed in these phenomenal concepts because accepting them seemed to commit one to accepting special reference of a logically private or privileged access kind that fall outside the range of the public physical world. The qualities which can only be ostensibly defined, it was thought, belong to an inner Cartesian world. But then a strange thing happened. Physicalists discovered phenomenal concepts, and in the context of the phenomenal concept strategy, began to talk as if they had discovered some previously ignored conceptual phenomena, recognition of which enabled one to understand why physicalists appeared to have problems accommodating the apparent privacy of experience. This is very strange in at least two ways. First, it is strange because, as traditionally understood, phenomenal concepts have their content because of the experiential qualities that they designate, and it is precisely these qualities that seem to fall outside the physicalist's remit. One challenge, therefore, facing the phenomenal concept strategy as a physicalist strategy is to explain how these concepts work and why they are needed if they do not designate special private qualities. But more fundamentally, it seems to me that the phenomenal concept strategy depends entirely upon the sorts of theories of reference which underlie semantic externalism. Without going too deeply into philosophy of language, semantic externalism is roughly the thesis that the reference of words or concepts, in other words, the things which concepts pick out, are not determined by the intention of the one who possesses the concepts, but rather is determined extramentally by the class of objects to which the concepts extend. In other words, intention does not determine extension. As Jesper Kallestrup explains, the upshot is that meaning is determined, at least in part, by external factors, possibly beyond speakers' ken, or so semantic externalists contend. The externalist strategy is, again, to let two internally identical speakers inhabit two environments identical apart from some imperceptible microphysical or sociolinguistic difference. Unbeknownst to them, their usage of the terms will thus pick out different natural or social kinds, and so what they express will be externally fixed in different ways, possibly behind their backs. So why think that the phenomenal concept strategy depends upon semantic externalism? Well, the whole idea behind the phenomenal concept strategy is that Mary can acquire new propositional knowledge about physical facts while learning no new facts, and this is supposed to be due to Mary previously lacking phenomenal concepts to form certain types of propositional thoughts about facts, even though she could form other propositional thoughts about these facts. But this would only be possible if the meaning of propositional thoughts is independent of our awareness of it, which entails semantic externalism. As DePoe explains, given semantic externalism, it is no surprise that two propositions under conceptually independent modes of presentation could rigidly designate the same referent without the subject being aware of the modal truths that hold for these propositions. If one grants semantic externalism to the physicalist is permitted to say that our grasp of the meaning of beliefs expressed by phenomenal concepts is not transparent. In other words, simply because it seems like the phenomenal mode of presenting beliefs about pain directly rigidly designates its meaning, and it seems like the physical functional mode of presenting beliefs about pain indirectly rigidly designates its meaning, it doesn't follow that we are in a position to know the directness of either mode of presentation. All that the physicalist needs is the claim that it is possible for both meanings to directly rigidly designate the essence of the property to which they refer. And since semantic externalism is the thesis that our introspective awareness does not give us access to the meanings of our beliefs, it is the perfect means for averting this sort of anti-physicalist argument. Now, I'm going to resist the temptation to get bogged down in a lengthy debate about the various motivations for semantic externalism and the objections to them. Instead, I will briefly canvass a few decisive objections to semantic externalism. The upshot will be that if this theory of reference is false, then the phenomenal concept strategy is doomed to failure from the start. Perhaps the most serious problem facing semantic externalism is that it apparently leads to a viciously infinite regress. Consider why it is that I am able to indirectly refer to something like my grandfather's favorite movie. Even though I have no idea what particular movie might be my grandfather's favorite, the reference is still meaningful because I do have a direct understanding of things like my grandfather and of movies. But semantic externalism denies this, since it denies that meaning is grounded in my own awareness. My knowledge of meaning is mediated only by thoughts. And of course, knowledge of the meanings of those thoughts depends on further thoughts, and so on infinitely. As John DePoe argues, the first problem is that if meanings are not grounded in virtue of the subject's being directly acquainted with its fundamental constituents, then there is no ground for the subject to understand the content of his own thoughts. The basic idea is that many of our thoughts succeed in picking out their reference and are meaningful because of our acquaintance with the properties and other predicate expressions that single them out. Suppose now that, contrary to Russell's theory of descriptions, that there is no foundational thought which grounds meaning and reference by being known directly. If this were the case, it would be impossible to think about or refer to anything. Without some foundational thought, we would be forced to say that all thought is meaningful by virtue of our grasp of other thoughts, all of which are also meaningful by virtue of our grasp of other thoughts. A little reflection on this supposition shows that it leads to a vicious infinite regress, which would prevent the possibility of anyone's having a thought that is meaningful. A second problem for semantic externalism, or more precisely for the causal theory of reference upon which it depends, concerns its ability to grant reference even when it seems clear that it should not. To illustrate, consider how the island of Madagascar came to have its name. As John DePoe explains, when Marco Polo named the East African island Madagascar, it appears that Polo misunderstood that the name was a native word that originally referred to a larger region of the continent of Africa that included Madagascar. Although Polo received the name Madagascar from a causal chain that is linked to the initial use of the same, he mistakenly applied the name to refer exclusively to the largest East African island. Since on the causal theory of reference, it is only necessary for a name to satisfy the right sort of causal chain to its referent, and Polo acquired the name Madagascar from a causal chain that originally referred to a larger continental region of Africa, it seems that the name Madagascar should refer to, and thereby have its meaning as the land that constitutes the larger continental region of Africa, despite all appearances to the contrary. DePoe gives further examples where semantic externalism, if taken to its logical conclusion, yields bizarre consequences according to which many terms do not actually refer to the things which modern people typically take them to reference because the proper external causal conditions are not met. Some semantic externalists try to salvage the theory by adding further conditions, such as that there must be an intention on the part of the speaker to keep the reference the same. But as DePoe notes, this concession by itself is a serious blow to a purely causal theory of reference, and it invites those who wish to salvage some aspects of the theory to adopt a theory that is a hybrid between the causal theory and the theory of descriptions. Even worse, it isn't clear that these cases can be resolved in favor of the causal theory by showing that the speaker did not intend to use the words according to their predecessors. In Marco Polo's case, he intended to use Madagascar in accordance with the native reference. Of course, what is needed to prevent reference change of this sort, and what the causal theory of reference rejects, is that to secure reference across its ancestral links, the meaning of a name must consist of its descriptive content, which remains essentially the same. In other words, it isn't enough to give the linguistic users in the causal chain of a name the right intentions to avoid reference change problems. Unfortunately for the causal theory of reference, some roads to reference change can be paved with good intentions. A third problem for semantic externalism is the inverse of the second problem which we have just explored. For not only does semantic externalism appear to grant terms the ability to refer to things which they should not, but it also appears unable to grant any meaning whatsoever to terms when it clearly should. This is especially clear in cases involving the proper names of people who may have never existed or of fictional characters. Again, DePoe says, does Robin Hood pick out a person who existed in history, or is he just a fictional legend? If Robin Hood existed, does the name Robin Hood refer exclusively to him, or does it refer to a fictional legend whose meaning can significantly diverge from the alleged historical figure? Finally, let's consider how the new theories of meaning and reference treats the names of pure fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes, Othello, and Captain Kirk. Recall that on the causal theory of reference, names refer to the entity that they rigidly designate, and according to semantic externalism, the meaning of a name is its referent. So, on the new theories, to whom do these names refer? It is deeply implausible to suggest that we attach no meaning with the names of characters of pure fiction. Much more could be said in detailing the full case against semantic externalism and in favor of semantic internalism, but I think that I have provided enough information for viewers to see that semantic externalism has serious difficulties in providing an adequate account of reference, and if this fails as a theory of reference, then the phenomenal concept strategy fails as a defeater for the first premise of the knowledge argument. As already noted, the first premise of the argument is called into question less frequently than the second premise. So with that, we will turn to dispel objections to the second premise of the argument. Daniel Dennett has published a widely discussed objection to the second premise of the knowledge argument in his influential book, Consciousness Explained. He essentially objects that if Mary really were to possess knowledge of all physical facts, then she would know what it's like to experience color, as he explains. The crucial premise is that she has all the physical information. That is not readily imaginable, so no one bothers. They just imagine that she knows lots and lots. Perhaps they imagine that she knows everything that anyone knows today about the neurophysiology of color vision. But that's just a drop in the bucket, and it's not surprising that Mary would learn something if that were all she knew. My point is not that my way of telling the rest of the story proves that Mary doesn't learn anything, but that the usual way of imagining the story doesn't prove that she does. It doesn't prove anything. It simply pumps the intuition that she does. It just seems obvious, by lulling you into imagining something other than what the premises require. So in short, Dennett proposes that there is no reason to suppose that if Mary really knew absolutely all physical facts, then she would not know what it is like to experience color. Consequently, we should not be too quick to believe the second premise of the argument. Now, in the first place, my defense of the second premise has not merely made an appeal to a bare intuition about Mary. On the contrary, I also supported it by appealing to what I take to be the correct analysis of empirical knowledge. Given the indirect realist theory of perception which I have articulated, there would simply be no way to know the phenomenal character of color experience through knowing any number of physical facts, for the simple reason that our knowledge of the physical world depends critically upon our prior knowledge of the phenomenal world. Nothing Dennett has said would address this second line of argumentation for the second premise. But secondly, Dennett also appears to be misunderstanding the Mary thought experiment. He appears to think that Mary is envisaged as being omniscient with respect to every physical fact, including those pertaining to her own immediate experience at every moment. But this is not what the thought experiment claims. It only claims that Mary knows every physical fact about the general function of visual perception. Howard Robinson clarifies, this expression should not be taken to mean that she knows every particular physical thing that is going on, only that she knows all the relevant physical science. It is the general scientific knowledge, the anti-materialist says, that ought to be enough to give knowledge of the nature of experience, if physicalism is correct, and this is consistent with not being omniscient about particular physical goings-on, such as what is happening to the rods and cones in one's own eyes at a given moment. Her perfection as a scientist will not tell her, especially not immediately and directly, about current particulars. Dennett's implication that Mary could, through physical knowledge, acquire the ability for direct recognition of colors is mistaken. As a third point, observe that Dennett also appears to be conflating two different types of knowledge. He is conflating third-person descriptions of human reactions to colored stimuli with first-person experiential knowledge. As DePoe points out, Dennett's story attributes to Mary the knowledge of the intrinsic features of color experience somehow from her knowledge of the physical properties of colored objects and the dispositions of human psychology toward those properties. The problem is that Dennett is open to the charge of confusing knowledge of two different sorts of things. There is a difference between possessing knowledge that enables her to pass a behavioral test involving color identifications and knowing what it's like to experience phenomenal redness. But Dennett is running these together. In fact, Dennett explicitly claims that this difference, which most people readily grasp, does not exist. In a footnote discussing the distinction between knowing what one would say and how one would behave and knowing what it's like, he writes, if there is such a distinction, it has not yet been articulated and defended. Thus, in order to accept Dennett's alternative account of Mary as equally plausible as Jackson's, it would require accepting something incredible, namely that there is no distinction between a person's knowing the dispositions to behave to certain stimuli and a person's knowing what it's like to undergo certain phenomenal experiences. But we can go further than merely expressing incredulity about Dennett's proposal that there is actually no difference between these two types of knowledge. We can actually argue that there is and must be a difference between them. One way to do this is to point out that it is logically possible that a person can have the typical external dispositional behavioral states of experiencing phenomenal redness without knowing what it is like to experience redness. Consider the inverted spectrum thought experiment as detailed by John DePoe. It is logically possible that tomorrow Brett wakes up and discovers that all of his color experiences are inverted. That is to say, that objects that typically cause normal-sighted people to see them as green now appear to Brett as though they are red. Given a complete systematic inversion of his color experiences, there is no contradiction in supposing that Brett would, given enough time, behave with the exact same dispositions as normal-sighted people. In other words, Brett exemplifies all the external dispositional states of seeing red when a red object is put in front of him, but the object appears phenomenally green to him. The logical possibility of the inverted spectrum thought experiment shows that there is a difference between having the external dispositions to behave toward colored objects and knowing the intrinsic character of phenomenal experiences of color. Given this difference, Dennett's response to the knowledge argument fails because it presumes that there is no difference. And we don't even have to rely on hypothetical cases like this one to establish this point. It is well documented that people with type 1 blind sight have no awareness whatsoever of any visual stimuli, and yet can still accurately report information that is normally acquired through vision, such as the location or movement of an object. Similar conclusions follow from examining the results of tactile vision substitute systems in blind people. The point is that the difference between these two types of knowledge is not only utterly obvious, but is also well confirmed empirically. As a result, Dennett's response to the knowledge argument is a complete failure. But perhaps the skeptic of the knowledge argument need not follow Dennett in saying anything as extreme as that Mary does not learn anything at all when she experiences color for the first time. As Richard Fumerton notes, virtually every philosopher discussing the knowledge argument agrees that something rather dramatic changes in Mary when she experiences color for the first time. They don't agree, however, on how to characterize the change, and in particular, they don't agree on how to characterize the dramatic change in Mary's epistemic position. Perhaps the skeptic can get around the second premise of the argument by granting that what Mary learns is not a truth or a proposition, but she nevertheless still learns something. If so, then the thought experiment does not show that the second premise of the argument is true. The most popular route for the physicalist to take here is the so-called ability hypothesis. The basic idea is that rather than learning a new fact or a new truth when she experiences color for the first time, Mary simply gains a new ability. As David Lewis explains, the ability hypothesis says that knowing what an experience is like just is the possession of these abilities to remember, imagine, and recognize. It isn't the possession of any kind of information, ordinary or peculiar. It isn't knowing that certain possibilities aren't actualized. It isn't knowing that, it's knowing how. Therefore, it should be no surprise that lessons won't teach you what an experience is like. Lessons impart information. Ability is something else. Knowledge that does not automatically provide know-how. And Lawrence Nemiro adds, underlying the ability hypothesis is the observation that, although the knowledge argument professes to display knowledge of what it's like to see red that is not expressible in physical terms, the knowledge argument merely assumes that such knowledge is on par with knowledge of physical information. That is, that the former, like the latter, is propositional knowledge. The ability hypothesis counters the knowledge argument by adducing reasons against the soundness of this assumption, and by arguing that knowledge of what it's like to see red is nothing but practical knowledge. Now let's be clear from the start that Mary unquestionably does acquire a new ability in the thought experiment. There can be no serious dispute about that. The question we want to answer regards if that is all Mary acquires, or does she actually acquire knowledge of a fact or a truth as well? Is merely acquiring a new ability sufficient to account for the change in Mary? There are good reasons to think that it is not. In the first place, observe that the ability to remember, imagine, or recognize a color is independent of the ability to experience it. We can rather easily imagine someone who, for whatever reason, is incapable of remembering, imagining, or recognizing the color red, and yet can experience it visually. As Brie Gertler argues, being able to visualize a particular color is neither necessary nor sufficient for knowing what it's like to see that color. It is not necessary, since a subject with no visual imagination could nonetheless know what it's like to see red, at least while attentively considering a current experience of that color. It is not sufficient, since a subject who has never experienced cherry red, and so does not know what it's like to experience it, could yet know how to imagine cherry red, namely by visualizing a hue midway between burgundy red and fire engine red. Now, Gertler's point here isn't sufficient to show that there is no version of the ability hypothesis which could explain what happens to Mary. It's just to point out that the typical abilities which are generally thought to account for Mary's new experience are neither necessary nor sufficient to explain the phenomenon. But, as Howard Robinson argues, it appears unlikely that any abilities one might wish to posit are going to be sufficient without offering a plausible physicalist account of experience. As he explains, it looks as if, from the ability hypothesis point of view, Mary's deficit when still in her room must consist in the fact that she cannot reactivate a state she does not yet possess, but of which she has total scientific knowledge. Is this a plausible account of what Mary is lacking by never seeing a color? Perhaps Mary cannot waggle her ears as some people can, though she knows exactly the physiology of how they do it. This does not seem to threaten physicalism, because it would not occur to anyone to think that this was a form of factual ignorance. There must be lots of states that Mary cannot activate because she has never had them in the first place, and these would not even seem to present themselves as factual ignorance, because they do not involve anything being revealed in experience. If the claim was that Mary did not know what it felt like to waggle her ears, then we would be back to the original problem. A non-tendentious abilities account would have to make explicit how the abilities in question are purely functional. The fact that we cannot say what Mary acquires is the ability to discriminate chromatic colors leaves us with no obvious abilities characterization that does not leave an untreated experiential element. The question remains, what abilities, purely functionally conceived, you acquire when you exercise a perceptual discriminative capacity for the first time. John DePoe goes even further. He does not merely suggest that it is unlikely that Mary's new state can be explained purely in terms of abilities, but rather that such an explanation is not possible even in principle. This would entail that no version of the ability hypothesis will ever be able to explain what Mary comes to know. As he explains, to see that knowing what it's like is not explained in a non-trivial way by the know-how that accompanies the right abilities, compare the following two explanatory statements. A. I possess certain abilities to recognize, remember, and imagine the phenomenal character of color experiences because I know what it's like to experience the phenomenal character of color experiences. B. I know what it's like to experience the phenomenal character of color experiences because I possess certain abilities to recognize, remember, and imagine the phenomenal character of color experiences. If the ability hypothesis is correct, then B should be seen as a non-trivial explanatory claim. However, B only appears to be true when the word because is taken in an evidential sense, not an explanatory sense. Instead, proposition A appears to be true when the word because is taken in an explanatory sense. This means that A and B have different truth conditions and different meanings. Thus, even if the possession of certain abilities perfectly correlated with knowing what it's like, we would still have good reasons to think that having certain abilities is not the same as knowing what it's like. The upshot, then, is that Mary's new knowledge of what it's like to experience phenomenal redness is properly understood to explain her abilities, not the other way around. To sum that up, the ability hypothesis has two major shortcomings. First, the possession of certain abilities is neither necessary nor sufficient for knowing what it's like to experience something, which implies that the two kinds of knowledge are not the same. And second, having the right abilities fails to explain one's knowledge of what it's like to experience something. Indeed, a person's abilities to recognize, remember, and imagine are better explained by one's knowing what it's like to have the conscious experience. Because of this, the ability hypothesis is not a promising reply to the knowledge argument. The other way in which physicalists might try to maintain that Mary does learn something new, but that it is not a fact or a truth, is by reference to something which I introduced earlier, namely the notion of acquaintance. According to the acquaintance response, Mary's epistemic change is consistent with physicalism because her newfound epistemic status does not involve acquiring any new propositional knowledge. Although Mary possesses all the propositional knowledge of what it's like to experience red from her complete account of physical truths, she still isn't acquainted with the experience of redness until her color vision is restored. But since the relation of acquaintance by itself does not constitute any sort of belief or truth, it's possible for Mary to really come to learn something new without coming to know a truth. As Alex Grezenkowski and Michael Tai explain, we will argue that there is a kind of non-propositional knowledge by acquaintance, that it cannot be reduced to propositional knowledge, and that Mary, before experiencing red, doesn't have it. As in my response to the ability hypothesis, let me begin by granting that, upon regaining her color vision, Mary does indeed become acquainted with the phenomenal properties of colors. But once again, the question that interests us regards whether or not this is all that happens to Mary. As Tim Crane observes, to deny premise 2, you have to deny that what Mary learns is a fact, but it is plain that acquiring ability knowledge or acquaintance knowledge is compatible with learning a fact. What these physicalists have to show, then, is that Mary only acquires ability knowledge or acquaintance knowledge and no propositional knowledge. There is a lot that can be said here, but I will rest with the significant observation that most physicalists make no explicit attempt to do this. And beyond this, we might well wonder whether or not the very notion of acquaintance is at all friendly to a physicalist picture of the world. I shall argue that the answer to both questions is negative. Regarding the first line of defense, it's very difficult to maintain that when Mary becomes acquainted with color experience, she does not thereby learn a new truth and thereby come to have propositional knowledge. Recall the Mariana thought experiment detailed in my defense of the second premise. There I showed how Mariana came to know new propositions. And of course, similar considerations apply to Mary. As DePoe explains, the Mariana case helps show the difficulty for the acquaintance hypothesis because it allows Mariana to be acquainted with the phenomenal properties, yet it illustrates that her mere acquaintance with phenomenal color concepts does not adequately account for her epistemic change. Both Mary and Mariana now can discover new propositions about the world because they now possess phenomenal concepts. Michael Tai protests against this sort of objection to the adequacy of the acquaintance hypothesis by saying, what needs to be appreciated is that knowledge by acquaintance of an entity is a kind of non-conceptual, non-propositional thing knowledge. I know the shade red simply by being directly acquainted with it via my consciousness of it. In the case of the phenomenal character of the experience of that shade, I know it in just the same way, by acquaintance. Our consciousness of things, both particular and general, enables us to come to have factual knowledge of them, but that consciousness is not itself a form of factual knowledge at all. Unfortunately, Tai appears to be confusing or equivocating between two different things. The acquaintance relation itself, which as Ty correctly observes is a non-conceptual and non-propositional sort of thing, is one thing, and then knowledge by acquaintance is another. In this quotation, Ty appears to be running these two things together. Putting this confusion aside, it remains unclear how Ty's proposal can avoid the conclusion that Mary acquires new propositional knowledge when she experiences color for the first time. As DePoe explains, when Mary is acquainted with phenomenal redness, she is acquainted with a new property, and she learns, if nothing else, that the new property is exemplified. She also learns that the property of phenomenal redness is correlated with certain physical properties she knew in the black and white lab. For Ty to deny that Mary comes to know a property when she is acquainted with phenomenal redness for the first time is tantamount to claiming that Mary is not acquainted with anything when she is acquainted with phenomenal redness for the first time. Turning now to the second line of argument against the acquaintance response to the knowledge argument, what makes physicalists so confident that they can unproblematically appeal to the notion of acquaintance in the first place? There are good reasons to think that physicalists can make no use of acquaintance because the stringent demands of a physicalist view of the mind would preclude the very possibility of acquaintance. As Thomas Raleigh puts the challenge, one obvious worry about the strategy of appealing to acquaintance as a way of defending physicalism is that this special relation of acquaintance that we can allegedly bear to our own conscious states is prima facie just as mysterious and difficult to explain for a physicalist as the qualia of phenomenal redness with which we started. This problem can be seen very starkly by asking a simple question. Why is it that the phenomenal qualities of experience, as opposed to ordinary physical objects, can only be known by acquaintance? Or, as Brie Gertler puts the question, why is it that, in contrast to other objects of knowledge, we can know phenomenal qualities only by experiencing them? Remember, the whole point of knowledge arguments for dualism is to demonstrate that certain mental items are ontologically different than physical items. Hence, by suggesting that these mental items are known in a way that ordinary physical objects are not, the physicalist does not save physicalism. He only highlights the difficulty for physicalism, namely that the epistemic difference between certain mental states and physical states points to an ontological difference between the two, suggesting that mental states are not themselves physical. As DePoe puts it, this objection notes that the acquaintance hypothesis fails to explain why optimal knowledge of the phenomenal can only be attained directly, whereas optimal knowledge of typical physical truths does not require direct acquaintance. This prompts the obvious question: what is ontologically different about phenomenal states that explains why, in order to know these truths optimally, the subject must be acquainted with them? The property dualist, however, explains that the epistemic difference is a result of an ontological difference. Unlike physical truths, phenomenal knowledge is about the properties that essentially characterize the ontologically irreducible and subjective character of consciousness. The epistemic dissimilarity cries out for a metaphysical difference to explain it. Without an explanation for why acquiring optimal knowledge between the physical and the phenomenal is essentially different, the acquaintance hypothesis actually highlights the main reason the knowledge argument leads to property dualism. A second problem with the physicalist attempt to employ the notion of acquaintance is that this is liable to undercut one of the major motivations for physicalism. A significant driver for the physicalist project is the idea that it presents a much simpler and slimmed down ontological picture of the world. In contrast to dualism, which posits both material and immaterial things, the physicalist supposedly claims only one type of thing: physical things. But acquaintance, and the sorts of things with which we are thought to be acquainted, are radically unlike the typical examples of physical objects. So it appears that physicalism really is allowing for two fundamentally different types of things, and then just claiming that both are physical despite the radical differences. If physicalists wish to countenance entities within their ontology, which are nominally physical, despite not appearing to easily fall within that category, then it seems that physicalism must abandon any claim to be simpler than dualism. This undercuts one of the chief motivations for preferring physicalism over dualism. As Brie Gertler explains, it seems hard to deny that physicalism is more parsimonious than dualism. After all, physicalism is the thesis that all of concrete reality is, or is metaphysically necessitated by, entities that belong to a single kind, the physical. Dualism rejects this monism, taking the mental to be an additional basic kind, so physicalism seems clearly more parsimonious. It recognizes fewer basic kinds of entities. However, the situation is not as clear as it seems. Physicalism is a genuine monism only if the physical names a single kind, but it is far from obvious that there is a principled, non-ad hoc way of individuating kinds so that all physical entities belong to a single kind. And if the physical comprises numerous fundamental kinds, physicalism may not be significantly more parsimonious than dualism. If the set of physical kinds is highly heterogeneous, then dualism may be just as parsimonious as physicalism. To sum that up, then, the acquaintance response to the knowledge argument is plagued with difficulties. First, acquaintance is not incompatible with Mary coming to learn a new fact. It needs to be shown that acquaintance by itself is sufficient to account for the change in Mary, and the Mariana thought experiment challenges the adequacy of acquaintance by itself to account for the change. Second, there are a variety of reasons to think that the very notion of acquaintance is not particularly friendly to physicalism in the first place. I have concluded that none of the foregoing objections to the knowledge argument is successful, and that, therefore, the argument succeeds. Physicalism is false, and some sort of immaterialism about the mind must be true. But which sort? It is widely thought that the knowledge argument merely supports property dualism, the idea that the mind has immaterial properties, but not substance dualism, the idea that the mind is an immaterial substance. For example, in his ringing defense of the knowledge argument, we find John DePoe saying, "The kind of dualism that the knowledge argument supports is property dualism, which should be understood differently from predicate dualism and substance dualism. The knowledge argument does not directly argue for the truth or falsity of substance dualism." But is property dualism actually a live alternative to substance dualism? Well, in a recent book entitled The Mind-Body Problem in Metaphysics, Ralph Steven Weir argues that if one accepts all the major motivations for property dualism, then these same commitments will lead them to substance dualism. As he explains, the usual response to the knowledge argument and the conceivability argument is to posit non-physical phenomenal properties, but to resist any suggestion that there exist non-physical substances. However, it is not clear that such responses are coherent. The intuitive problem here can be seen by reflecting on the standard property dualist position. Standard property dualist views say that the world is largely as physicalists picture it. Breaking with physicalists, however, property dualists add that human organisms also have non-physical phenomenal properties. A conscious human being, on this picture, can be thought of as a composite of a philosophical zombie and some phenomenal properties. There is a sense, of course, in which the physical component is not a zombie when the phenomenal properties are present. Equally, however, there is a sense in which the physical component, considered in itself, and abstract from any phenomenal properties it might have, remains a zombie. In this sense, property dualism says that everyone has a zombie, just as everyone has a skeleton. Weir highlights the fact that the property dualist constitution of the human person, as well as the typical arguments which are used to support it, commit property dualists to things like the independence of immaterial mental properties and the conceivability of philosophical zombies. For viewers who may be unfamiliar with this concept, a philosophical zombie is not an undead person who roams the earth in search of brains to eat. Rather, a philosophical zombie is someone who is physically identical to and outwardly indistinguishable from a living human person, but who has no mental life. These commitments, he argues, should also commit the property dualist to substance dualism. He makes this case by way of three arguments. The first he calls the symmetry argument. He formulates it as follows. 1. Physical things are metaphysically complete. 2. Metaphysical complementarity is a symmetric relation. 3. Therefore, if there are non-physical things, there are non-physical substances. Anyone who accepts the conceivability argument for standard forms of property dualism is under pressure to accept 1, and 2 is intuitively appealing and gains abductive support from its explanatory power. If 1 and 2 are true, then no non-physical thing could have a physical metaphysical complement. Hence, as 3 says, non-physical things would have to be non-physical substances if they exist at all. Weir then presents what he calls the compresence argument. The basic idea here is that property dualism would require the strict compresence of both physical and non-physical properties in a physical substance, but it's unclear that such a state of affairs is actually intelligible. As he explains, there is no intuitive problem with physical and non-physical phenomenal properties being loosely compresent. There is no reason why something massive like a brain and something phenomenal like a pain should not be or belong to different parts of a composite. But it is not clear that physical and non-physical phenomenal properties can be strictly compresent. To see this, picture a zombie on the one hand and a non-physical phenomenal state on the other. Then try to picture these things coalescing in the way that strictly compresent properties do. This is difficult to achieve. It is not clear what such coalescing would consist in. At best, it is possible to think of the conscious experience as occurring where the zombie is, to tell yourself that it is present in the same region. But this is not enough, for the shape and size of an object are not just in the same region. Rather, they interfuse and compenetrate, so that the shape is a shape of that size, the size is a size of that shape. The properties appear immiscible. It should be emphasized that this problem arises only if we assume, with property dualists, that phenomenal properties are non-physical things that answer to our pre-theoretical concepts of them. There is no parallel problem for physicalist positions on which phenomenal properties are functional in neurological states. Neither is there any problem for substance dualist or idealist positions, for on these positions, physical and phenomenal properties are not strictly compresent to start with. This is a special problem for property dualism. And he formulates this basic line of reasoning into an argument for substance dualism as follows. 1. Physical and non-physical phenomenal properties cannot be strictly compresent. 2. If anything has physical properties and non-physical properties, these properties belong entirely to different parts of that thing. 3. Therefore, if anything has physical and non-physical properties, it is a composite of a physical and a non-physical substance. And finally, Weir puts forward what he calls the parity argument, essentially arguing that if popular conceivability-based arguments for property dualism are accepted, then so should conceivability-based modal arguments for substance dualism, like the one explored in my last video. As he explains, proponents of the conceivability argument conclude that consciousness is something over and above the physical. However, there is a further conclusion that we might draw. If the physical facts do not necessitate the existence of conscious experience, it seems to follow that the physical things, taken together, could exist by themselves, and hence that physical reality is a substance or has substances as parts. Suppose for now that the existence of physical substances is indeed a collateral outcome of the conceivability argument. This is not in itself a problem for property dualists, but the fact, if it is a fact, that this conclusion follows from the conceivability argument is a serious problem. This is because it will then be possible to formulate a disembodiment argument for the existence of non-physical substances by transposing references to the physical and the phenomenal in the conceivability argument. He goes on to formalize the argument as follows. 1. If you accept the conceivability argument, you must accept the phenomenal disembodiment argument. 2. If you accept the phenomenal disembodiment argument, then you must accept the existence of non-physical substances. 3. Therefore, if you accept the conceivability argument, then you must accept the existence of non-physical substances. So we have ample reasons to believe that property dualism is not really a live alternative to substance dualism. And if that's true, then the knowledge argument is not merely an argument for property dualism, but it is actually an argument for a more robust substance dualism. This video has put forward the knowledge argument for dualism and addressed the many objections which it faces. I have argued that the objections to the first premise fail because they assume an untenable theory of reference. I have argued that objections to the second premise either misunderstand it or else fail to establish that the Mary thought experiment does not show that Mary acquires new propositional knowledge. And lastly, I have argued that the argument does indeed support substance dualism rather than mere property dualism. The case for substance dualism is now complete. All that remains is to dispel the arguments against it.